Hello and good evening. I'm Melissa Idris. You're watching Consider This. Joining me on the show tonight, I have Dr. Ross Tapsell, Director of the Australian National University's Malaysia Institute, which is based in Canberra. Now, he was in town recently to give a workshop on the impact of social media in Southeast Asia, looking at rising trends within the region. And he joins us tonight to discuss a little bit more about the situation here in Malaysia. Welcome, Ross.
Thank you for having me,
Good
Melissa.
to have you on the show. Now, I kind of want to touch very broadly first on the issue of misinformation first, right? Or fake news, as most people call it. Ever since the term came into public consciousness, I would say around the time President Trump got into office in the US, about 2016 or so, it's been a few years now, and it's become a part of our lexicon. Almost everyone understands what so-called fake news means or seems to represent. But what do you think about the substance of that conversation? Do we truly understand how it impacts our lives and how it's spread? Has the conversation progressed far enough, in your opinion, Ross?
Yeah, it's a really good point. Fake news, I think, was the Oxford Dictionary's word of the year in 2016. But yeah, since that time, politicians and many journalists and the mainstream media are often talking about fake news this and fake news that, but what exactly does fake news mean? And it might sound a little bit boring to sort of define this and to talk about definitions, but it is really important to talk about what is fake news and what isn't.
Right.
And one of the problems that we saw in Malaysia, of course, was in that previous law, which was created by the previous government, and the anti-fake news bill was, you know, how fake news was defined, being really vague as news which is fake or false. Well, what exactly does that mean? So it is really important to have some of these terms in our lexicon as we describe them. Misinformation, which is where it's sort of misleading but perhaps not deliberate.
Okay.
Disinformation, which is clearly deliberate, usually by syndicates or paid companies putting out fake, false disinformation. And just bad journalism, which is often what politicians complain about when they talk about fake news.
Okay. All right. Well, there's also the element of social media, right? And just I'm wondering whether falling under the category of disinformation, there seems to be, according to the Oxford Internet Institute, last year's report said that organized social media manipulation has more than doubled since 2017. And they found that 70 countries now are using computational propaganda to manipulate public opinion. Talk to me a little bit about that, how social media tends to empower propaganda and disinformation in really new ways that we're struggling to understand now.
Yeah, right. Or that the majority of the public would think about as just cyber troopers in Malaysia, trolls in the Philippines, buzzers, I think they're more likely called in Indonesia. Again, defining them can be really hard too. Are we talking about computational propaganda, which is where Twitter bots are created by computer scientists in, say, the Ukraine or Russia or China or indeed locally? Or are we talking about teams of, say, young university students who are given money to put out stuff on social media, which is largely disinformation practices? And I've been researching that in the Philippines, in Indonesia, and for quite some time in Malaysia, because the cyber trooper phenomenon has been around for quite some time, right, in Malaysia.
Is there a similarity between these three different countries that you talked about? I mean, is the Malaysian situation with, say, cyber troopers similar to that of the Philippines, for instance?
There's a lot of similarities. They're often connected to elections, and they're often paid by politicians, political parties, or connections to those political parties. Obviously, in the Philippines, it's been well documented that President Duterte has had and that Oxford report you referred to talked about links from the trolls to being pro-Duterte in their messages that they were pumping out. Of course, there's been a lot of debate here in Malaysia about BN cyber troopers and various other political actors who are involved in this. But it's certainly a rising trend. They're right to say that. The latest trend, by the way, is on Instagram, of course.
On Instagram?
Yeah.
What kind of disinformation is on Instagram?
Well, or at least click farming is the term used now
Click
for Instagram, where you pay young people, usually students or underemployed people, to go on Instagram and click a lot of likes to promote your product. And that could be political, or it could be business, or it could be other forms of Instagram celebrity type thing. But that's what's happening on social media. You want to raise your profile, you can pay people that will do that.
Right. So, okay. So let's take a look at the election-related element of this. You talked a little bit about that, right? It may seem, I guess, common sense, but why is it that this almost always ratchets up during election campaigns?
Yeah.
What is it about election campaigns that makes this such fertile ground for disinformation to spread?
Right, and in Southeast Asia in particular, largely because of usage. I mean, so many people are engaged on social media platforms here in Southeast Asia. Malaysia, of course, a lot of young people under the age of 35 are using social media on a daily basis, sometimes 5 hours a day on social media platforms, which means, of course, political groups and PR companies are now selling their expertise as a way to try and win votes through promoting their candidates' product on social media. Of course, in Malaysia, there's even a more local context where the now government, previous opposition, was really good at social media campaigning because they had to be, because the mainstream media often did not report them more as widely as they did the government. So they had to use social media to get their messages out.
When you say social media, Ross, what kind of social? You talked about Instagram. Are you talking about like Facebook and Twitter? Is that the platforms that are used?
Right. It depends a bit on the country. Facebook, of course, is the most used, and Facebook is really where most of the action is, and that can involve around geolocating certain and targeting certain voters in certain areas, because you can use Facebook data to figure out who they might vote for. In some cases, as I've interviewed some of these people in the Philippines, they're creating fake Facebook accounts in order to put out certain types of information about the candidate. So we're seeing some of that happening now as disinformation producers. In Twitter, it's mostly bots trying to manipulate hashtags. So increasingly, when you see a hashtag that is trending on Twitter, often, skeptically, I will think, oh, that's driven by bots or driven by cyber troopers or trolls on Twitter. But that's how you try and get your conversation out on social media in Twitter. Can
you break it down for us? I mean, let's use an example of an election campaign, right? So what happens? I'm trying to think of it as, an environment where there's pollution, and it's kind of noise pollution. And the more you add to this conversation, it becomes even more polluted. Is that how it works to kind of muddy the waters? Is that how disinformation works? Or is it direct, fake information about a certain candidate, fake information about a certain situation, or, for instance, we were talking before this, and this is not an election example, but we were talking about the fires in Australia, and you had mentioned that there was a lot of fake news or disinformation out there about it being arsonists who started it. Is that how disinformation works, that it's to confuse rather, or to be false? Explain it to me, please.
Yeah, so there's a number of ways this could work. Maybe if I start talking about election period, gives you a sense of why this is rising. I guess the first thing to think about is that if you are running for politics, if you're a political candidate, you need to have a social media strategy in the digital era.
Right.
So that would involve hiring a PR company or hiring people who are experts on social media. And they might be just working on your Facebook page or your Twitter profile. But at some point, you've got to think about a black campaign or a negative campaign against you, and how would you counter that negative campaign? Which often means you've got to have a team of people who will counter a black campaign against you. And often those teams of people end up putting out negative campaigning about their opponent. And then it can really, as one campaigner told me, In the US, Michelle Obama said, when they go low, we go high. But here, when they go low, we go lower.
Even lower.
So that's how it works in an election sort of disinformation or election negative campaigning in the digital era.
Okay.
The other issue might be around sort of how a certain event or an issue is discussed on social media. And that's when you see manipulation of hashtags. So in the Australian context, certain groups or fossil fuel companies, for example, might want to push the idea that the fires are caused not by climate change, but in fact by individual arsonists, and they're the people we need to crack down on.
All right. Okay, we're going to come back a little bit and continue this conversation about misinformation, disinformation, and fake news, touching on regulation. Don't go anywhere. Stay with us right here on Consider This.